Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, April 25th, 2017 at 1 o'clock Eastern, and this is Advancement Live. I'm your host, Andrew Gosen. On today's live broadcast, we're continuing exploration of a theme that we introduced back in February, using data to understand alumni engagement. In that February conversation, we talked about the considerations involved in using research tools and techniques to collect information about our audiences and their behavior. How do you choose the right tools? The right questions, the right audience? Can you do something with your results? Today, we're going to go deeper into these questions with a deep dive into one particular case study from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Last time, our conversation was more conceptual, but today we are getting into the weeds on Advancement Live. Advancement Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be part of our live broadcasts by sharing your knowledge, and participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using Higher Ed Live. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or you can take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. Today's episode is made possible by Constituent Research. Constituent Research is a boutique research and consulting firm for the higher education sector. Constituent Research uses a range of qualitative and quantitative approaches to help you better understand and connect with your alumni, donors, students, prospects, and other audiences. Find out more by visiting constituentresearch.com. We're tweeting out a link right now where you can sign up for a newsletter to receive monthly higher ed research insights and best practices. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. Trusted by thousands of higher ed professionals, M. Stoner webinars are jam-packed with timely, strategic, and actionable knowledge. Check out their library of on-demand content from digital storytelling to myth-busting websites. We are tweeting out a link right now. With that, I'd like to move on and welcome today's guests. First up is a returning guest, Mike Hannes. Mike founded Constituent Research LLC in 2014. After extensive experience managing and conducting research programs for colleges, universities, graduate school programs, and higher education firms and organizations, Mike has designed and conducted projects across the constituent lifecycle from prospective students to current students, alumni, and donors. Mike previously worked in Slover Lynette Strategies higher education practice. He has also worked at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand as a benchmarking and survey analyst, and is a senior advisor in statistics to the New Zealand government. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Mike is joined today by Adam Neerman. Adam is the Director of Leadership and Annual Giving at Chicago Booth. He has 15 years of experience in annual giving, beginning in medical center development and then higher ed fundraising. Before coming to lead the annual fund efforts at Chicago Booth, he built and managed a team that focused on undergraduate young alumni giving at the College of the University of Chicago, raising alumni participation of the graduates of the last decade from 12 to 40%. At Chicago Booth, Adam oversees direct mail, digital fundraising, reunion, and leadership giving teams. His charge at Booth is to double the size of yearly annual giving efforts from 5 million to 10 million by the end of the university's comprehensive campaign, and he has a personal goal to close a $1 million annual fund gift. Adam, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's get into the meat of our conversation now. For those of you out there in the audience, don't hesitate to ask questions using the hashtag HigherEdLive, and I will do my best to introduce your questions to the conversation as they come in. So let's go on and get started. The case study that we're going to be talking about today comes from an annual fund survey that Chicago Booth undertook in partnership with Constituent Research. And I'm really excited about the point-counterpoint possibilities here. I'm having somebody from the Booth side and having somebody from the Constituent Research side talking about the development and execution of this project from their respective perspectives. So we're going to start off at the beginning by talking about the goals of the survey and then move on to results and actions based on the results. So let's start with you, Adam. Could you tell us a little bit more about this survey, where it came from, and the context in which you decided that you needed to conduct some research to understand your audience better?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So there's a couple things that led me to find more research on giving and alumni giving to Chicago Booth. One was that the university was in about to enter the public phase of a comprehensive campaign. And I really didn't want the annual fund to get lost in all of these campaign messaging. The second thing was that it had been about 10 years since the business school had really done any research on why alumni give. And so, it was past time to really get some new data and new perspective on, what our messaging was, what our approach was, and why we should be doing it. When I looked at, what I wanted to do with the annual fund and having done this research, I really had two clear goals that I wanted to find out if I could do. One was, is it time to change the name of the annual fund? The annual fund is been the name of our, giving fund campaign for the last 10 years or last 50 years or so. Maybe it was time to liven things up a little bit, try something new. And then the second thing was just to find out messaging that worked. And so I really wanted to, explore those two opportunities.
And then knowing that those were your business goals, how are you thinking about defining success as you embarked on this project?
Right. So I wanted to have a top three. Well, first off, for the name, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just guessing at the right name. So I wanted to either have a clear case that alumni supported the idea of a name change from the annual fund to something else, so that I could actually have evidence to present to my boss as to, well, I like the name, but alumni do too, or vice versa. And then the second thing was that I wanted to come away with at least three distinct messaging points that we could really use for the annual fund and really be disciplined about using those messaging points. Something that we can make sure that every single solicitation, every single communication had at least one of our, three main messaging points that we could use for the annual fund. And so really just have actual items, actual points, actual messaging pieces that made sense to alumni and that we were very consistent about using.
Great, that sounds like a really focused concept for the research project. As you were beginning to talk to Mike and constituent research, did you have an equally strong sense of how you wanted to approach the research design, or were you open to suggestions from Mike's experience?
That's a good question. So I was actually lucky enough early in my career, when I was just starting out here at the University of Chicago 12 years ago, to be handed a slide deck of research that was done prior to my arrival. And my boss said, here you go, use it, or put it up on the shelf, whatever you want to do with it. And so I actually kept this dog-eared copy of survey research, and that, I found it just incredibly valuable in really defining the messaging points and making sure that we were using what really worked with alumni. And so when I came to Chicago Booth, I knew I wanted to have that same thing. I wanted to have that copy that I could dog-ear and keep up on my shelf and really use to guide my messaging. And so, having worked with some companies, I knew what I was looking for, and was reaching out to Mike and some others to help get a proposal about what to do. And so, I didn't quite know how I wanted to go about it, but I knew that I needed to do more than just throw out some A/B messaging or bring alumni together for an unscientific focus group. And so that's when I reached out to Mike.
When you came to Booth, did you inherit any? You said it had been about 10 years since Booth had done any sort of annual fund-related research. Did you inherit any data or analysis from that decade-old stuff that you could employ at all, or was that so out of date that it was irrelevant?
That's a funny question. I did actually find a slide deck from some research that had been prepared, and it made a recommendation that we should change the name of the annual fund to a business force fund. And I looked at it and I'm like, what in the world is a business force? I'm very glad my predecessor did not follow that advice, because I could not tell you what a business force actually is. So I put that back up on the shelf and knew I had to actually get some much better research.
Business force makes me think of SEAL Team 6 and Pinstripes or something like that. So Mike, when Chicago Booth came to you with this project, what was your initial sense of how you thought it might be productive for them to approach this? Do you have sort of a general playbook that you like to employ for questions like the ones that Adam was asking?
Yes.
Yeah, well, let's answer that first, and then I can go on to
Okay, well, I was going to say yes and no. For the most part, yes. I think early on, Adam really had a strong sense of what specifically he wanted to get at. It was more a question of budget, scope, whether we do qualitative and quant, basically the how we're gonna do this. We did consider qualitative, doing some focus groups or interviews, just because that offers more of a deep dive, and I knew he wanted to do some message testing. But in the end, we opted for the survey so that we could reach out to a much broader audience, and I think in the end that was the right decision. Yeah, so I would say there are tried and true methods for the most part. I think the fact that he had all the objectives pretty laid out kind of slotted in a lot of like the types of research questions that made sense to ask. So you know, his directness and his approach really kind of moved things along quickly in this regard.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit about the sorts of questions that you developed, and then also how you thought about audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start with audience. We initially thought we were going to do a sample email to all alumni who we had an email address for. Then we realized that just the scale, with the scale you can get from an online survey, we might as well survey everybody. So it actually became a full alumni study, because that's, you know, not much extra time or effort added, and you get a lot more responses. So in the end, I think we got over 3,000 respondents to the survey. In terms of types of questions, I included some broad questions so we could get at kind of the overall satisfaction with their alumni experience, you know, likelihood to recommend Chicago Booth, how connected they are to their alma mater. But then we were able to ask specific categories of questions around the communications and messaging that Booth was either using and wanted to get feedback on or was considering. We asked specific questions about changing the annual fund name and whether it made sense to, or what kind of impact changing the name may or may not have on their willingness to give. What else? Yeah, there's a lot of message testing around how the messages resonated with them, and also if those messages would have any impact on their likelihood to give. So.
Great. So I think with that, we've set the stage, and at this point, I'd like to move on and start to talk about the actual results that you got. One question first. You said there were about 3,000 respondents. That was out of how many potential respondents?
I think we got about just under a 9% response rate, which from what I hear is kind of on the average. It's a little low, but it's also statistically significant by a lot. So it's pretty strong, even though 9% doesn't sound like a lot. It is hard to get alumni to get engaged in research in this way. So, but in the end, we were pretty happy with the response rate.
And so we're talking about an alumni population of 30 to 35,000 approximately?
Yeah, among those who we have email addresses for.
Okay.
Valid email addresses, I should say, yeah.
Great. So let's move on to the findings. Mike is going to show us some actual data here. And he's going to talk us through the data, and then Adam's going to add in additional color commentary as he sees fit, sort of his thoughts as he saw the data begin to come on in. So Mike, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to do a screen share here. One moment. So hopefully everyone can see that. This is just laying out the primary research objectives of the survey. The ones highlighted are the ones Adam already discussed, which is testing the specific communications that Booth uses. better understanding the experience and expectations of donors and non-donors, and then also getting alumni input on the annual fund name. In addition to that, we also ask questions around alumni satisfaction, how connected they feel to Chicago Booth, and how that satisfaction could potentially impact their giving. We also did a series of measurements on some of their attitudes and perceptions around giving, as well as attitudes and perceptions about Chicago Booth and how they feel about it as an alumni. In addition, I used a lot of the demographics and giving history that Chicago Booth already had on record, and I was able to append that, and then able to use it as a lot of analytical variables to look at all sorts of different groups across their alumni population. This is just a little bit about the methodology. It was a 33-question online survey. We targeted all Chicago Booth alumni for whom we had a valid email address. This included everyone up to the 2015 graduates. It was conducted last May, and like I mentioned, the response rate was 8.5%. We also weighted the results based on their donation status, because oftentimes in a survey like this, you'll find that donors are much more engaged in general as alumni, so they're going to respond at a much higher rate. So therefore, we use their donation status to weight the data so that the overall results you'll see on the following slides is representative of the actual overall population and not just predominantly donors. So this is getting into a little bit about the big picture questions we asked up front. We first asked about their satisfaction and the value of investment in their booth education. Having worked with Chicago Booth across most, or if not all, of their audiences, we often ask this type of question about the value of their investment, and it always rates very highly. In general, people go to Chicago Booth because they look at the MBA as a value, they look at it as an investment. It's a good investment for them. In addition, you'll see that their overall experience was positive. It either exceeds or highly exceeds their expectations for most people.
Mike, if I could jump in here, this slide drives me a little crazy because 7 out of 10 highly value their degree. Yet I can tell you that I don't have a 70% participation rate in alumni giving, like I should if this data is actually true. But it does show that roughly that does match up with our lifetime giving rate. About 70% alumni have given to the school ever, which is pretty great. And it does show that I don't have big problems to address beyond, before I can ask for giving. I'd also like to, just jump in and briefly say about, what we went into the survey to find out. I think it's really important to do survey questions, to have a really specific goal in mind, because I've seen a lot of surveys about attitudes on giving that's very general, but not very specific. And so I really wanted something I could specifically use. I think, there are some questions that you asked that were very general that helped kind of set the stage on giving behavior. But, I knew that I needed messaging, and I knew that I needed very specific questions about the name change to be addressed. I'd also say, too, that, if I could look back over here.
Sorry, I'll bring it up there.
I was thinking too, and we might uncover this in a later slide, but I wasn't, one of the things that I was looking at when we broke out the data was that, we have overall donors and non-donors. I actually did try to break out some other groups and segmentation on that. Some of our leadership level, some of our recent alumni of the last 5 years. And I think, a lot of what you found out was that some of these messages were working for everybody equally. They're all the top messages resonated equally amongst the same groups. And so, as you see the donors and non-donors, this really told me that I did not actually have to do as much segmentation by donor and donor giving behavior or demographics as I originally thought I was going to have to.
Great. I'll keep going on the next slide here. I'm sorry, let me share my screen. So following up on the fact that alumni say that the investment in their MBA is very high and they were satisfied, we then asked a couple of additional questions. And we find that while they're satisfied with their overall experience as a student, then they also feel proud to be a Chicago Booth alumni. When we ask whether Booth did an excellent job of building a relationship with them as a student, and then also whether we believe Chicago Booth is doing an excellent job maintaining a relationship with them as an alumni, the results get much lower. I do want to point out that this is only the top rating, the 5s on a 5-point scale. So it's kind of done this way to be extra dramatic, but it does highlight a interesting difference. And we'll see something similar on this next slide, where we ask about how connected alumni feel to Chicago Booth, and about half are only somewhat connected. So I will throw this back over to Adam to have him explain what this means for Chicago Booth.
Well, I think what we interpreted this data to show is just that we needed to help redefine what connected actually meant, and that alumni could stay connected to their alma mater through their giving, and try to really position it that way. We can't engage every alumnus or alumna as a volunteer. I can't personally pick up the phone and call everyone and have them come back to campus every year. It's just not going to happen. And so, I think for some donors, maybe the lower level, it's just stressing that their gift every year is just an annual way to stay connected to the institution.
In the survey instrument itself, was there any attempts to define what connected meant, or was it left up to the respondent to view it through whatever lens he or she felt appropriate?
In this case, it was left to the respondent. The question word I'm showing is more or less what they saw. So that is a valid point, though, right? Because typically, and actually, there may have been some in the survey, and it's just not shown in these slides. But you can ask more specific questions about the connectedness. How are you connected? In what ways do you define connection? But this was just a broader question because, like Adam said, we really wanted to focus on like the annual fund name change and so forth. So I was really just kind of throwing out some general questions in case we needed them, kind of like as a umbrella to frame the survey. I didn't want to get too involved in. It wasn't about connection, so those questions were kept to a minimum.
And it also feels like with some of these more attitudinal questions, the real value might appear longitudinally if you keep asking the question over and over again, and you can anchor your own baseline level of satisfaction or connectedness and then track how you're doing moving that needle over time.
Yeah, that's right. And also I did feel like, because I think it's more standard to ask these broad questions, I was a little hesitant to be almost too focused on what Adam wanted, because I thought if we get results that say, don't change the name, we don't like these messages, it's kind of like, what am I going to tie this back to? So it was almost like a backup, like, let's see how this relates to their satisfaction, to their connection, to how they feel about Booth in general. I think in the end, it wasn't as useful as it could have been, because we could have just spent more questions on actually asking more direct questions. But I do think it was kind of a safety net in this case, in case we were getting, either too negative of feedback where the questions were too direct or they weren't helpful enough in a big picture sense. So if that makes sense. So should I continue with the findings? Just share my screen again here. On this next question, this is more specifically about their not just giving to Booth, but how they view their giving to Booth, and what else they're donating to. We asked these questions to kind of set the stage before we got more specifically in how they feel about giving to Booth, why they do or do not give, etc. So first we asked where Chicago Booth ranks among their philanthropic priorities, and probably not surprising to Adam, it's not the highest. A good half or more say that it's not a priority at all, or it's a low priority. We followed up by asking the top philanthropic priorities they do support, and there's a broad range. And then I've included different donation statuses, so you can see differences in how donors and non-donors are responding. But even because the results are weighed towards non-donors, that third column there looks similar to the overall. But so top philanthropic priorities include social and civic community service groups, undergraduate institutions, etc. So, did you have anything specifically you wanted to share on this, Adam?
No, it's not a surprise. I don't think it should be too much of a surprise to anyone. We don't tend to address this directly unless I think the only thing we've done here is when we are talking to some of our donors in person who are already giving. We have people ask, like, maybe not have Chicago Booth your top priority because that's unrealistic, but we want to do whatever we can to make Chicago Booth one of the top 3 priorities of your philanthropic priorities.
And I'm just curious, how often do you hear that the undergraduate institution is the priority? I think that's pretty common, right?
It is. I would say we actually hear it 50-50. There will be donors who say, my undergrad, it's, they changed my life. I owe it to them, or they, will switch back and forth. I would say about, there is a small percentage of people who say, I don't give to my undergrad at all, only my business school, which is always gratifying to hear, but I'm just being selfish there.
It also feels to me like that small subset of respondents who said that giving to Booth actually is their top philanthropic priority could be interesting to follow up with, just to see if there are any commonalities there. Anything that you could try to leverage or engineer to try to convert more people into that category?
That is a great question. I think when we looked into it, those were donors who had been giving consistently for years. Those were all the donors who had, 10, 15, 20 years of unbroken, consistent giving. So in some ways, I think the fact that they've been giving consistently for decades or 2 decades or more has helped make it more of a priority, just that repeated behavior. That's an assumption, but it would be worth doing more testing.
Well, it sure suggests that the habit aspect of this is perhaps just as powerful as the vision of the institution at any particular point in time, which means we should probably all invest more time and effort in cultivating young alumni giving, right? All right, let's get back to our results.
Okay. So this is a question that I always find interesting to add. Even if we have the data where we know whether they've given and how much and when, asking the question, have you ever made a financial contribution, is really interesting here. You can see that many alumni are not aware of their actual giving history. If you look over on the right, we have the actual giving segment. This is the 8 segments. I believe there's 8. Yeah, 8 segments that the data were actually weighted on. So everyone in the alumni database are in one of these categories. And then next to it, based on the respondents, is the percentage who believe they've given. And you'll see there's a very, very obvious trend going down. So 99% of people who actually gave know they've given. And then going down from there, as time passes, people become much less aware.
Mike, I'll say this, this is always interesting too. What we've actually done with this data is just it reinforces a tactic that we've already used. And so one of our most successful annual giving mailing pieces is what we call a bill piece, or someone calls an ugly Betty. And all we do is it's just it's not even a letter, it's just a form. It's kind of like an invoice. And it's a kind of like a renewal piece. So you gave this year, you gave last year at this time, please renew your gift. We keep sending those out. We used to do it just once a year. Now we do it multiple times a year, depending on the audience. And it works every time. And it's still one of our most top performing pieces. But I'll tell you what doesn't work is that, we looked at giving donors a way for kind of a record of their giving, a record of their past giving, even if they had made their gift past 5 years ago, just to try to remind them that they had made their gift. We want them back in the donor community. That did not work at all. In fact, it was surprisingly a low performing piece to show you that you have been a donor, that you have given. It made zero impact in reactivating past donors. And I'm not sure why, I can guess, but I'm assuming that people don't like to be reminded that they haven't been a donor to an institution in over 5 years. So that is not an effective form of guilt.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep going here on the slides. We then asked what impact each of the following types of either communications or outreach, what may impact their willingness to give or give more to Booth. We found here that there really wasn't anything that would really turn the dial in terms of making them give more. These are the people who rated each of these a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale, and you'll see that they're 35% and below. However, I don't think there wasn't a lot of negative reaction to this. A lot of them actually fell in the 3s. They were very neutral, meaning I think there was just a sense of disinterest or apathy there. I included this just because it's kind of interesting. We asked household income near the end of the survey just to see if that was a important piece of their giving or their behavior. If you see, so these are their actual salary ranges, and then you'll see all the way to the left the percentage who have never given, and this is the actual data from the Booth database. You'll see that they're more or less similar. So it's not, people aren't more likely to give over time if they're making more money, at least at Chicago Booth. I just thought that was interesting. The other finding here is that if you look at this by Chicago Booth program, the full-time graduates of the full-time program are much more likely to give at some point. My hypothesis is probably because they're kind of nurtured from either a very early alumni stage or possibly before they even graduate to start giving with the annual fund. So their rates are much higher than other MBA programs at Booth. Do you want any comments on that, Adam?
Just to let everyone know, we have the full-time MBA program, an evening weekend MBA program, and an executive MBA program. And it has always been the case that alumni of the full-time program give it slightly higher rates than the other two. And we're not exactly sure why, but we have good guesses. The other, just seeing the data here, that over 50% of those who responded to the salary question had an annual household income of 200,000 or more. Just was a nice little nudge and reminder that I should be setting my ask amounts pretty high. So, never ask for $20 if, someone's making 200,000 or more a year. All of our first asks for anyone who's not a donor is always 250. And so, we've always consistently found that the more you ask, the more you get with our population. We're a dollars focused program. We're not a alumni participation program. And so that really makes a significant impact when you ask for more.
Great.
Thanks.
We'll keep going here. Here we get more specifically into the annual fund name and the potential name change. We asked which of the following fund names would most make a positive difference to you personally in connecting with this mission. You'll notice that in the overall, none of them were incredibly high, but the one with the word impact in it, Chicago Booth Impact Fund, had by far the highest. It was double that of the second highest. We also found that any use of the word impact also seemed to have a positive impact, whether it's Chicago Booth Impact Fund, in the other open ends that we let people write in potential names, and a lot of people suggested the word impact be included in that as well. So that was an interesting finding as well. We then asked
just a question. So you decided not to market test Business Force in that question?
No, I did not. I left that one off the list. I did do some informal sampling of names prior to giving them all to Mike. I looked at all of what our peer school names were calling their annual funds, or some version of, and I had some creative ideas and winnowed them down a little bit before giving them to Mike. But Mike, go on. I have just maybe now's a good time. You briefly showed the next slide, and I'm just going to skip ahead, where you asked if the name made any difference. And so you really did find that for most alumni, the name it didn't matter at all. And so even though we had the word impact and most alumni chose the Chicago Booth Impact Fund as their ideal name, I weighed it against the risk of trying to rebrand and reestablish what the Chicago Booth Impact Fund does. And, I think the risks of trying to rebrand it were significant enough that it made more sense to keep it as the annual fund. We talk about habits, we talk about building habit and building a tradition of giving annually every year. And so even though there are some problems with the name the annual fund, namely that it implies that you only should give once a year, not multiple times a year, which doesn't work for monthly giving. And it doesn't, the annual fund doesn't describe what it actually supports or what it does. It's not unique to the school. We just felt that the risk of trying to rename it, calling it the Chicago Booth Impact Fund, wasn't worth it. Because, and this is what made the difference for me, as you said, the word impact itself made such a difference in how alumni responded to our statements. And I think we'll see that a little bit more in the coming slides. But, I remember a question where we asked, does it matter to show me what my gift does, what it helps support, or does it matter to show me the impact of my gift? Well, I think those two are kind of the same thing in some ways, and we talk about it differently, but just that word impact alone makes such an incredible difference. And maybe it's a trendy word, maybe it's popular right now, but it actually, alumni respond to it.
So Adam, as you went into this, did you have a hypothesis that you might want to change the name? Did this data help sort of disprove, or were you really totally neutral and just asking the question?
I wanted to change the name because maybe I thought it was a better description. I could call it something what it actually is. I could draw more attention to the annual fund or annual giving efforts by changing the name. I was really taken aback by how much the word impact made a difference. So I think it was something that, at the end of the day, the risks of changing the name and trying to reestablish that brand were a little bit more than I was willing to take. And I thought that I could just take the word impact and make it into a tagline and just incorporate that into the messaging without having to risk actually changing the name of the fund itself.
Gotcha. Great. All right, Mike, you have more results for us, right?
Yeah, a couple more. So this is where we get in more specific communications topic areas. Not uncommon. This usually goes across the Chicago booth student experience from when they're applying to when they're students after alumni. Some of these messages always resonate with a Chicago booth alumni or student, which includes ensuring that Chicago booth remains a top business school, and in particular, helping to maintain the value of their Chicago booth degree. You'll see that these are the top, those are highlighted in blue, the top ones there. So in general, being the best and having impact is what resonates the most with alumni. More specifically, this is the same question, however, broken out by 5 of the key groups of people that Adam wanted to look at during the course of the project, including recent alumni, high potential donors, etc. You'll see that across the board, the ones highlighted in pink first off are people who 60% or more of that group rated that highly. But you also see that the percentages fall in basically almost the exact same order. So as Adam had stated earlier, we found that across the board, the messaging resonated very similarly with all groups, whether that's by donation status, the program graduated from, gender, decade of graduation, et cetera. It was very, very interesting that the messages were very universal in terms of how they read with people. More specifically, Chicago booths high quality business education and recruiting the best faculty are among the most important messages to alumni. So I'll throw it back to Adam.
Sure. So thanks, Mike. I think it's no surprise that business school alumni are pretty competitive. So we kind of knew that the competition, keeping Chicago booth the top business school would work pretty well, and I'm still surprised at how well it works as a message. And so we didn't just take the top 3 of these messages because I think some of them are pretty similar. And so what we did, as we developed our top 3 messages, we took keep Chicago booth the top business school. We already talked about the word impact and what a difference that makes. So we use the word impact, and giving to the annual fund is how you make impact at Chicago booth. Just using that word in all of our communications. And then what we did, what we weighed separately was that the next message that resonated most highly was at a very community-based messaging. Now, even though it resonated pretty highly as a message for giving, we also knew that from other research that we had done from some of our testing with our faculty and Center for Decision Research here at the school, was that community-based messaging results in a lower gift size. And again, we did not want to get more donors at the expense of raising more dollars. And so even, we know that it resonates highly among lots of alumni, but the downside is that message results in lower gift size. And knowing that, we were specifically purposeful in not using that message. So what we ended up with is that going down the line, we just said, help a student have the same experience you had, the same academic experience. And so connecting it to helping, connecting it to academic, and bringing in, kind of touching on faculty and having the best faculty and really the teaching and learning experience that alumni had. And so that's, the results that you got for us, Mike, were great in helping guide us. But we didn't just take those rote off the page and apply them to our annual fund messaging. And so, I think you just have to be mindful of when you take those messages, like, does it work on an actual solicitation, and are there unintended consequences for some of these messages?
So it's sounding to me like you got value here because you had questions you wanted answered. you had a good survey instrument that helped give you data that helped you think through that. But at the same time, you mentioned this additional data set that made you think that maybe the community-based messaging wasn't what you were after, and that wasn't what you were after because you kept your eye focused on your long-term strategic business priorities. And by tying all those things together, you got value out of this. And I think that's great. I think that, I'm excited to have this case study out there so that people can think about how the various different pieces intersect. Mike, a question that I'd like to ask you, given that you work with a broad range of clients, do you ever see, I know sitting on the institution side that it's not at all unusual to commission research, get it, and either it doesn't tell you what you want to hear, so you put it on the shelf, or you just did it because you needed to tell management you were doing something and you just put it on the shelf and you never spend any time thinking about it. How often do those scenarios pop up?
Surprisingly few, or I should say fortunately few in my case. I think it's more the latter, where people feel they either need to do something or are told to do something, like let's validate what we've been doing, or let's confirm what we're doing is working. And I think, that can be useful, but there's also less engagement from the client and the team in that type of work if they're not trying to, either look forward or do something that's going to drive impact. They're kind of just, it's more like a temperature check, if you will. So I've been fortunate where that isn't the case in a lot of the work I do, but I think it is common in general. I think I was fortunate because working with Adam, like I had said, he was so specific in what he wanted, and he had specific, the specific messages to test and the communications that he wanted to know about, that it really just kind of made the work so much easier in that sense. But yeah.
Great. We're beginning to edge towards 2 o'clock, so I've got a final set of questions I'd like to pose to the both of you. The first of them is, if you were to do this all over again, would you do anything differently?
I'd love Adam for Adam to start with that one.
I don't think I would. I knew what I wanted to get, and I got it, and I've been using it, which I'll share momentarily, unless you want me to go into that now, Andrew. All right. We needed messaging. We needed a test of messaging. We needed a consistent set of messages that would raise more money for the school, and it has. It's absolutely worked. It also saved me time on trying to segment my messaging in too many directions. So what we've done has worked, and I wouldn't change anything. This year I'm happy to report, at least for to my boss anyway, that we are $1 million ahead in our annual fundraising year to date, and we're about 600 donors ahead. So even using kind of high dollar asks and impact messaging and non-community messaging, we're still ahead. And so it's really working. We're putting these things out there. It's made it easier for our writers, for our communications team to have these 3 messaging points that every communication has to have 2 out of the 3 messaging points, and anything where we talk about giving, annual fund giving to the school, and that discipline and that tool has really been useful.
Do you imagine continuing to use that messaging after the end of the campaign, given that it's working for your audience?
I think we will. Things change. The word impact might not be as impactful in the future, I guess. So I think it's worth revisiting at some point. And I think there are some, some nuances too that we can find out a little bit more. If by doing maybe some follow-up research, a little bit more qualitative digging into it, that we can further refine some of these messages.
So Mike, do you have any thoughts about something you might try differently, or are you also pretty happy with?
I was pretty happy with it. I think, like I mentioned before, I think I could have even been more direct and concise in some of the questions I asked, given Adam's very specific goals. And I also think, well, we did find out what we needed to find out. I think there could have been a little more nuance added by either adding qualitative or even asking a couple more qualitative questions. The survey was like very focused on quantitative. There wasn't any open-ended responses and so forth. So I think there is some nuance that could be added, but I do think in general, the specificity and directness of our line of questioning was really successful in this case.
Great. All right, let's move on to our penultimate question. What's the shelf life for the data from a project like this? How frequently should something like this be repeated, if at all?
I would say, in general, like that the actual survey instrument itself, it doesn't have to be very often. I think things like the more general questions about engagement, satisfaction, and connection are only going to change slightly over time. I think the goal would be if following up on the research, if there's either specific questions or follow-ups that come out of that, that would be good to test. Or if Adam is implementing specific messages or themes based on those findings, you would want to retest those over time. So I think it's more of a not so much repeating the study, but kind of iterations or kind of honing in on specific things you want to keep moving in the future.
Great. How about you, Adam? Well, I'm going to keep using it until it doesn't work anymore. So I think, it's not broke, don't fix it kind of mentality. I think, annual giving is all about creating habits and repetition and making sure your messages get out there and get heard. And so I think, for me, these are producing results. And until they stop producing results, I'm going to continue using them. Great. So on to our final question. For those viewers out there who are thinking about embarking on a project like this, what's one piece of advice that each of you would offer to them to make sure that they get as much out of it as they can?
Well, if I could start, I would just say prioritize what you need to know, and then look at what you would like to know, and then kind of exclude all the other stuff that you may not need or may not be helpful. I think with alumni or advancement research specifically, there's so many different, not necessarily in this case, but there's also often a lot of groups from social media folks, marketing, communications, alumni affairs. They all want either to insert questions or they want a specific angle to take. So I think prioritizing that first will definitely help guide where the survey instrument goes, what the objectives are, and so forth. So I think that's key.
Adam?
Right. Absolutely. Be specific, be focused. And I also think, too, think about how you're actually going to use the results in action and what you're going to do. If you think about how you're actually going to use it and what form it's going to look like, it's much easier to think about, what you want to get out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's a good note to end on. Adam, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really great conversation. And like I said before, I'm really glad this case study is now going to be out there on the archives. I think I certainly may revisit it next time I decide to tackle a survey project myself. So thank you both so much for joining us. And with that, we are at the end of our show. Thanks, as always, to our program sponsors, Constituent Research and M. Stoner. And once again, Mike, Adam, thank you so much for sharing your expertise during this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.